King John of England reigned from 1199 to 1216. His reign, marked by numerous defeats, rebellions, and disputes with both his barons and the church, has left a legacy of infamy. Despite his initial successes in expanding royal power, King John's failure to maintain control over his kingdom ultimately led to widespread discontent, culminating in the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, a pivotal moment in the history of English constitutional development. John's reign was characterized by military failure, poor leadership, and a series of bitter disputes with his barons, which resulted in a loss of land in France and significant internal instability. His complex relationship with the nobility, coupled with his authoritarian rule and heavy taxation, earned him a reputation as one of the worst English kings. However, his reign also laid the groundwork for significant changes in the English monarchy, notably the gradual shift of power from the crown to the barons, and the development of the principles of liberty and the rule of law. John was born on December 24th, 1166, the youngest son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His early life was shaped by the political and dynastic struggles that characterized his father's reign. As the youngest of several children, John was not initially expected to inherit the throne. Instead, his older brothers, William, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, were seen as the heirs to their father's vast Angevin empire, which spanned much of France and England. John's early years were marked by family conflict, particularly with his brother Richard, who would eventually become King Richard I, and the ongoing power struggles within the Angevin Empire. In the late 12th century, the relationship between Henry II and his sons was increasingly strained. In 1173, John joined a rebellion against his father alongside his brothers, though the rebellion was unsuccessful. Despite this, John was eventually forgiven by his father and given control of lands in England and Ireland. When Richard the Lionheart ascended to the throne in 1189, John's position was further complicated. Richard spent much of his reign away from England due to his involvement in the Crusades, leaving John to manage affairs in England. However, Richard's absence only intensified John's ambitions for power. John's relationship with Richard was fraught, as he repeatedly sought to undermine his brother's authority. After Richard's death in 1199, John claimed the throne of England, despite the fact that his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had a strong claim to the crown as Richard's designated heir. John's ascension to the throne was marked by immediate opposition, particularly from the French, who supported Arthur's claim. John, however, was able to secure his position as king through a series of military victories and political maneuvers. But his reign was soon overshadowed by conflicts both within England and with external enemies, particularly France. One of the defining features of King John's reign was his strained relationship with both the English nobility and the church. John's attempts to consolidate power often put him at odds with the barons, who resented his heavy-handed tactics and his frequent demands for money and military support. John's conflict with the nobility began early in his reign, when he demanded that his barons provide him with financial and military resources to support his ambitions, particularly in his war with France. These demands were compounded by John's heavy taxation, which many of his barons found oppressive. Additionally, John's tendency to seize lands and titles from rebellious nobles, as well as his arbitrary and capricious treatment of his subjects, earned him widespread distrust and resentment. John's relationship with the church was similarly troubled. In 1207, After a dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John found himself in conflict with Pope Innocent III. The Pope excommunicated John and placed England under an interdict, which meant that religious services were suspended and sacraments were not administered. This was a significant blow to John's authority, as religion played a central role in medieval English life. The interdict was not lifted until 1213, when John reluctantly agreed to submit to the Pope's authority, acknowledging the Pope as his overlord and paying a large fine. The conflict with the Church was a reflection of John's broader difficulties in maintaining effective control over his kingdom. His insistence on absolute authority and his inability to compromise with key institutions, such as the Church and the barons, undermined his legitimacy as king and contributed to the widespread discontent that characterized his reign. One of the most significant failures of King John's reign was his loss of English territories in France, which had been inherited from his father, Henry II, and were crucial to the English monarchy's power. These lands, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, formed the heart of the Angevin Empire and were vital to England's control over France. John's failure to retain these territories stemmed from a combination of military missteps, poor leadership, and internal discord. In 1202, John lost a crucial battle at the Battle of Mirabeau, where his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, was captured. This defeat marked the beginning of a series of military setbacks that culminated in the eventual loss of Normandy and the surrounding territories to King Philip II of France. The loss of these lands weakened John's position in both England and Europe and diminished his royal authority. The loss of Normandy was particularly humiliating for John, as it was a major blow to the English crown's control over France. The loss of these territories also had economic consequences, as the lands in France were a significant source of income for the English monarchy. This loss, combined with John's other failures, contributed to the widespread perception that John was an ineffective and weak king. The growing dissatisfaction with King John's rule eventually culminated in a rebellion by the barons, who sought to curb the king's power and address their grievances over his arbitrary rule and heavy taxation. In 1215, the barons, led by influential figures such as Robert Fitzwalter, rebelled against John's authority and demanded that he sign a document that would limit his power. The result of this rebellion was the Magna Carta, a historic document that was signed by King John on June 15, 1215, at Runnymede, near Windsor. The Magna Carta is often considered one of the foundational documents in the history of constitutional law, as it established the principle that the king was not above the law and that the rights of the barons and the church must be respected. The Magna Carta included provisions that protected the rights of the church, guaranteed certain legal protections for barons and free men, and limited the king's ability to impose taxes without consent. While the Magna Carta did not establish a democracy, it laid the groundwork for the development of constitutional monarchy in England and would influence later legal and political developments. However, King John's reaction to the Magna Carta was not one of acceptance. He quickly sought to annul the agreement, and civil war broke out between the king and the rebellious barons. The Magna Carta was reissued in later years by John's successors, and it became a symbol of the struggle for liberty and the rule of law in England. King John's reign ended in 1216, when he died of dysentery on October 18th. His death marked the end of a tumultuous and controversial reign, but it also paved the way for the ascension of his son, Henry III, who was only 9 years old at the time. John's legacy is one of failure and controversy, but it also marks a turning point in English history. His inability to maintain control over his territories, His conflicts with the nobility and the church, and his tyrannical rule led to widespread rebellion and the signing of the Magna Carta, which would eventually become a cornerstone of English constitutional law. Despite his many shortcomings, John's reign had a lasting impact on the development of the English monarchy. The Magna Carta, while initially a document aimed at limiting John's power, would become a symbol of the principles of governance and the protection of individual rights. The document's legacy would continue to influence English law and political thought for centuries. King John's reign was marked by conflict, failure, and rebellion, making him one of the most infamous monarchs in English history. His loss of French territories, his strained relationships with the nobility and the church, and his authoritarian rule created a legacy of instability and discontent. However, his reign also led to the creation of the Magna Carta, one of the most important documents in the history of constitutional law.